So, were you successful? Let's implement it together. And for that, I'll first of all add my script section here. And we definitely need a method here. A method which should be triggered when the form is submitted. I'll name it submit data, but you can of course use any method name you want. Here, I now want to get the values entered into this input, this text area, and this input. And we got two main ways of collecting this. Option one is that we use some data properties, and then we use vModel or an input listener to update it with every keystroke. So to collect the free values in free data properties and update each data property's value with every keystroke. That would work and there's nothing wrong with it, but I will use the good old refs again. And for that here, I'll add a ref key, a ref property or attribute on this first input and name this title input. You know that these ref identifiers are up to you, but of course you want to pick a name that describes which element you're pointing at. Here I'll add a ref which will be the desk input for description input. And on the last input, I'll add a ref with an identifier of link input. So now we got these free refs registered, and we can now use them. We can now use them here in submit data to get the entered title by referring to this $refs title input, which is the ref I did use here, right? Title input, that's the ref I used on this input. And then this points at the input HTML element object, which has a value prop which holds what the user entered. And I'm going to repeat that for the entered description, referring to the desk input value, and for the entered URL, referring to this $refs URL input.value. Sorry, that was link input, so it should be link input.value. So now these are the free values the user entered, and of course they may be empty. We'll take care about that in a next step. For the moment, I'll assume they're not empty. And if they are not empty, then I want to ensure that they get added to our resources. So how could we do that? We could, of course, emit a custom event and then listen to it in the parent component of this add resource component. But since we add this add resource component dynamically, like this, that will not be super easy to do. Of course, we don't have to use this dynamic component here. We could use vif to switch between two components, and then we could use custom events. But again, I want to practice provide and inject here. So therefore, I'll stick to provide and inject, and I'll implement it differently. I'll start in the resources.view by adding a new method, the add resource method. Here I want to get the title, the description, and the URL, and I want to generate a new resource and add it to this stored resources array whenever this method is triggered. So in here, I'll create a new resource JavaScript object, and that object needs a unique ID. For that, I'll just create a timestamp here by instantiating the date object, and I'll then get a string timestamp by calling toISOstring. That is unique enough for this purpose. Then we need to set a title property in this object, because all our stored resources have a title property, and they also have description and link properties. So we'll need to set those two, and of course store the values we're receiving as arguments in those properties. So add description and set this equal to description, and add link and set this equal to URL. So this now is a new resource, which now can be added to the stored resources by simply pushing it there, or if we want to add it at the top, by unshifting, which is basically like push, but at the beginning of the array. So here I'll unshift the new resource. And I will then also set the selected tab to stored resources so that we switch the tab when we added a new resource. Now with that, back in add resource, I want to make sure that from inside submit data, I can call the add resource method we just added to the resources.view. How can we make this work? Well, we can provide this method as well. So here in provide, I can add a add resource key. This key name is up to you though, but I want to point at this add resource, hence I'm pointing at my method. I'm not executing it here, I'm just pointing at it. And now we can inject this add resource key into the add resources component. Here we can add the inject key and inject add resource like that. And this allows us to call it here instead of submit data. Here we can now call add resource and forward the entered title, the entered description, and the entered URL. We can save that all. And now if we go back and I enter some test data here, something like that. If I click add resource, well, I forgot one thing. Obviously, it's nice to have the submit data method, but I also need to trigger it when the form gets submitted. And currently, that's not happening. So on the form here, I want to add a submit listener and also prevent the browser default with the prevent modifier. And then point at submit data, so at this method we've been working on. And now with that added, which of course is a quite important step, with that added, if we go back, I can add my test data again here. And now if I click add resource, this works and here's our test resource. And if I click the link, I'm indeed taken to Google. So that's working. If I go back, by the way, the data is lost because it only exists in memory as long as our app is running. We will later learn how we can persist data and store it on a server, just as a side note. But with that, we added this. There is one thing I want to fine tune though. At the moment, if I start entering data here on the add resource tab, and then I leave the tab and I come back, my entered data is lost. And that's a scenario we also covered in the last course module. We can simply fix this by going to the resources.view and wrapping our dynamic component with the keep alive component, like this. If we do that, the component will be cached and the data will not be lost. So if we do that, and I now enter data here, if I switch the tab and come back, my input is still there. And with that, the add resource form is almost finished, but one important piece is missing. I also want to let the user know when he or she tries to submit invalid data. For example, when the title field here is empty. And at the moment, this is possible. I of course want to prevent that this happens, and I want to show the user an error message. And I want to do this with a nice overlay, with a custom dialog. So just as before, feel free to try this on your own. Build such an error dialog and show it when the user submits invalid data. We'll build it together starting in the next lecture.